Así, sin más preámbulo, para dar el inicio oficial a Perú Sostenible en vivo, es un honor darle la bienvenida a Peter Bakker, presidente y CEO del Consejo Empresarial Mundial para el Desarrollo Sostenible, o el WBCSD por sus siglas en inglés. Peter expondrá sobre la nueva Visión 2050 del WBCSD, que plantea una agenda de acción a implementar en todas las industrias, buscando garantizar un futuro más sostenible y próspero para todas las personas dentro de los límites del planeta. Una vez concluida su exposición, podremos recibir 2 o 3 preguntas del público, las cuales pueden enviar a través del chat. Recuerden que esta sesión se realizará exclusivamente en inglés. Dentro de la plataforma tenemos la opción de traducción en español. Para ello, en la plataforma, justo debajo de la ventana que están viendo, en este momento se encuentra el botón para idioma traducido, para escuchar la ponencia de Peter Bakker en español. Hello, Peter. It is an honor for all of us to have you as our keynote speaker to inaugurate Perú Sostenible. Please tell us where you are joining us from, and the floor is yours.
And it's to be with you. I am calling in from Geneva in Switzerland in Europe, so far away, but it feels great to be with you in Peru, and thank you for making the modern technology available to talk to you. So what I would like to talk to you today is really give an update on where do we see sustainability globally. What are the key challenges we need to collectively deal with? And what is a Vision 2050, that will help us shape the world and will help business really take the lead in the transformation that the world now needs. In April of this year, we at WBCSD have published Vision 2050, Time to Transform, and I'll use some of that information to take you through. Obviously, this is a photo of myself. For those of you who do not know me, I've been in business for a long time, most recently in TNT, a big global transport and logistics group, and I've been with WBCSD now almost 10 years. So WBCSD is the global organization that I think you are also now related to, bringing together more than 200 global companies at CEO level to work on the acceleration towards a sustainable world. The 200 companies you can see on this slide here, lots of logos from around the world. Some of the largest companies in the world participate. And what if you have not followed us recently? The big change that we now see emerge is that companies from all sectors are now really into sustainability. We all thought at one point that the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, would reduce potentially the interest, the budgets, and the attention to sustainability. But what we can tell is that the contrary has happened. Sustainability is now much more important. It's no longer about philanthropy. It's no longer about corporate social responsibility, but it's really transforming business models of all companies in many sectors in the world. So a short introduction on how we look at sustainability. And the news is quite clear. You know, we believe that business as usual, the business models that have made all of us successful in the past decades, is no longer viable. Economically, it is now risky. Environmentally, the dangers and the risks are piling up. Socially, we see unrest in all parts of the world, and I'm sure Peru has its fair share of that. But also legally now, it becomes an outright dangerous strategy to assume that we can just continue the models that have made us successful in the past. So we need change. COVID-19 has obviously amplified a lot of that. You know, the enormous human suffering that it has brought to many parts of the world and I'm sorry to hear also in Peru has brought significant loss of life, is not only showing us the human suffering, but has amplified inequality, has shown us how interconnected the world is, in how fast a virus like this is able to spread, but also how connected elements of health, economic performance, and environmental degradation actually are. It has shown us how ill-prepared many businesses in the world were for a shock like the pandemic and the following lockdowns, the layoff of staff that it has caused. But it has also shown something positive, and that is that if you put humanity under big enough a crisis, it is able to actually come up with solutions, as in the case of COVID, was demonstrated by the development of vaccines in absolute record times. So let's hope that as we become more and more clear about the other crises that the world needs to deal with, we are able to mobilize the same powerful and fast responses. Because what we do know, COVID is a horrible shock to the system, but there will be other shocks that will follow, whether it's the economic fallout of COVID, whether it's climate change, or the even bigger risk that biodiversity collapse will cause us. We do need to be mindful of future shocks, and therefore of how do we make our businesses and our business models as resilient as possible. The good news is that the business is now expected to be the leading voice and the leading actor. Each year in January, just at the start of the World Economic Forum, Edelman brings out its trust barometer. And in this year's barometer, it was said that business is now the only trusted institution in the world, the only reliable source of information. This year, obviously, mainly around COVID and how to keep safe from COVID. But business is also is expected to do more than just successfully manage its business. And that's where this gets really interesting. The world is under severe challenges. Business is a trusted society, trusted actor, and business now has the public mandate to really act on that. And this is important. Now, in the global risk report that is on this slide here, and I hope you're not watching me on an iPhone because then you will struggle to read all the detailed boxes. But what you can see here is on the left you see the years. So at the bottom 2012, at the top 2021, and the green in the boxes that you can see means the environmental risks that the global risk report recognizes. So if you look at 2020, for the first time in the history, the top 5 risks in terms of likelihood, as well as 3 of them in terms of impact, were recognized to be environmental risks, i.e. sustainability risks. 2021, there's one red box appearing, and that's obviously infectious diseases related clearly to the COVID pandemic. But through the years, it has now become clear that in the risk profile for any company anywhere in the world, we must have a clear view of the environmental risks that we are exposed to. And this message got amplified only 2 weeks ago when the new assessment report 6 came out from the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Scientists, in which they very clearly now said, we are in code red for humanity. The safe operating space for humanity is set at 1.5 degrees of warming. We are at 1.1 degrees of warming globally now. We must really begin to decarbonize at the highest possible time. And that's why we say time to transform. Politically, globally in the multilateral regimes of the United Nations, we know exactly what to do. In 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals, you will recognize The logos behind me have been agreed, and this is basically the agenda for the future we want. Also, the Paris Agreement, which said we need to stay below 2 degrees and aim to stay as close as possible to 1.5 degrees, is clear and still in place. And all countries in the world have now ratified both of these important frameworks. So what we now need as business is a framework for action. And that's really what we hope that Vision 2050 will present. And I'm hopeful that also in Peru, this will be a relevant framework that you can consider when you plot out your company, but also the Peru sustainable pathway going forward. So in some ways, what we have said is sustainability in itself has become too complicated. I talked about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. There are many sustainability aspects that people are concerned about. But if we really want to focus our action and with that focus the company impact that you can all have, then there are 3 crises that we think we really must address now with the highest urgency. The first one is climate emergency. We no longer speak about climate change, it is an emergency. The second is nature in crisis, and that of course relates to the loss of biodiversity. And the third element is mounting inequality that we see everywhere in the world, not only between the rich north and the somewhat developing south, but also within countries, inequality is beginning to now severely disrupt societies. Let me give you a few numbers around climate. If we recognize science as was stipulated by the IPCC, and if we agree to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, the world as a whole can continue to emit what we emit today for 8 more years, and then we have to switch everything off to 0 emissions. Well, anyone in the audience who has ever studied the global energy system will know that switching off a system of that size 8 years from now is impossible. That is not going to happen. That is why we have come up with a science-based pathway in which we say we must globally ensure that emissions peak in 2020. We need to halve emissions by 2030, halve them again by 2040, and be at net zero no later than 2050. So when you hear people talk about net zero by 2050, that is actually a translation of science into a science-based pathway. But to halve your emissions by 2030, any business leader on the call today will realize that requires a drastic transformation of the way you do your business today, build your products today, or the type of products that you are able to bring to the market. And this is why we say it is now time to transform. So what we've said, the vision for 2050, the long-term vision is quite clear. In 2050, the world will have 9+ billion people. We want them all to live well, meaning we need to respect people's dignities, people's rights. We need to ensure that basic needs are met for all people and equal opportunities to develop are available to all. But to collectively, the 9+ billion people living well need to respect the planetary boundaries. We need to stay below 1.5 degrees. We need to use nature in a sustainable way, and we need to make sure that the Earth system that we all rely upon is actually resilient and able to regenerate itself. So what are we going to do to help business come to an actionable agenda? The first thing I just shared with you is we need a shared vision. 9+ billion people living well within the planetary boundaries. That's the vision that we should all keep in the back of our mind as what it is we strive for. We then need to agree what are pathways to get to that vision. So I've told you there are three global challenges: climate emergency, the loss of nature, and mounting inequality. We want to move to a world where 9+ billion people live well within the planetary boundaries, and we need to design pathways to get from where we are today to where we want to be in 2050. We must not only talk about a pathway to 2050, because with all respect for my audience today, not too many of us will be still in business in 2050. So we have actually built an agenda that also sets very clear objectives and actions for what business should have achieved by 2030. The second thing we notice, or the third thing we notice, is we do need to have a new way of thinking. This is not a challenge that engineers alone can solve. We need to bring new ways of thinking, or what we call a mindset shift. And then last but not least, we need to have new leadership in place. So what we have done, I'll move my own face to the left, is we have said what are actually the most important products and services that business provides to society today. Because it is through the products and services that we all provide to society that we can actually transform the world. So you see them here on the screen. We have identified 9 main categories, sectors or product categories that the business provides. So you see them move from energy, transformation, living spaces, which is the built environment, products and materials, financial products, connectivity, health and well-being, water and sanitation, and last but not least, food. So what we need to do is create pathways for each of these products to decarbonize them, to deal with biodiversity loss, to contribute to equitable society, and then the long-term vision of 9+ billion people living well can be achieved. We've mapped all of these pathways that you see here on the left against the SDGs. And if you look from top to bottom, then you will see that if all pathways transform, all of the SDGs will also be delivered. Because the SDGs are a very powerful framework when you're running a country or a United Nations. For a business producing products or services to its customers, it is not the easiest input framework, but it is a good framework to measure the impacts that we have against. So what we have then done in Vision 2050, for each of the 9 pathways, we have said, what are the long-term visions that we need to achieve? So let me take the food one at the bottom right of this particular slide. We need to move towards a regenerative and equitable food system that can produce healthy, safe, and nutritious food for all. So here you see why this is called a system transformation. It is not only about what kind of food we produce, it includes the environmental impact, the regenerative side of it. It includes the income for farmers that produce the food, the equitable side of it, but it also looks at healthy and nutritious food to deal with problems of hunger or obesity that we know the current food system includes. So again, for each product category that business provides to society, we've created an individual vision. And depending on the business that you may represent in the audience, you can pick one or more depending on the business portfolio that you manage and select the visions that you should include. For each of these, sorry, I'll stop at this page one more second. For each of these pathways, we have then said, what are the key transitions that we need to consider for that vision to be achieved? And then in Vision 2050, you will find what are the 10 action areas that each business active in one of these 9 boxes should consider implementing inside its own strategy in the coming 10 years, i.e. in the period until 2030. So what we try to do is we have a big global vision, 9+ billion people living well within the planetary boundaries, break it down into visions for the main product categories that business provides to society, define a vision for that, for those categories, and then a clear 2030 agenda for each of those product categories. If any of those boxes are relevant to your business, my immediate advice to any business leader would be, take those 10 action points for your categories on this page, and then really mirror that to your business strategy to see what you can do to contribute to the transformation ahead. Like I said, it's not only about engineers changing products or the way we make them, it is also really about how do we think about the way we think about business, and what are the methods and the performance metrics that we use. So we've said there are 3 mindset shifts that we need. Let me start with the resilience one. It's obvious, as I said, in COVID-19, we have all been surprised by the shock. Many supply chains in the world are still railing from the disruption that COVID has brought. I don't know about Peru, but globally, the newspapers are now full every day of the disruptions in the computer chip supply chain, halting assembly lines in automotive sectors, making computers very hard to deliver at this point in time. So we need to make sure that our business models become more resilient to shocks, because more shocks will follow. We need to get to a mindset of regeneration, circular economy, regenerative agriculture. Those are the concepts that really will be the tune of the future that we need to now all learn to embrace and put into our business models. And last but not least, actually centrally in our belief, is we need to reinvent capitalism. And this is not an ideological debate against capitalism, but how do we actually aim capitalism to include the environmental and the social risks, the environmental and the social impacts of our businesses in the way that we make decisions, set strategy, disclose information to capital markets, and at the end of the day, get rewarded into our cost of capital. So this capitalism, in my mind, is crucial. We need to include the voice of all stakeholders, not just shareholders. We need to make sure that externalities are integrated into our performance measurement, and we need to have a much longer term perspective. And what you will see globally, and at one point, certainly also in Peru, boards of companies will not just be held accountable for the financial performance of their business, which obviously will continue to remain important, but will also be held accountable for the environmental and the social performance, i.e. of the natural and the social capital that the company puts at use. So on resilience, I've said, this is really not only about how do we ensure that we are adaptable, but it is thinking in terms of diversifying locations where we produce stuff, making sure that our supply chains are robust, can deal with shocks, and really modularity is built into our thinking. And as I said, the whole regenerative model is around, we today are relatively okay at risk mitigation, but we need to move to a model where we really allow both the environmental systems that support us to be regenerative. And the regenerative agriculture push is one that is now best typifying that move. So what we're saying is, we no longer can just deal with climate or just deal with biodiversity. We need to think about ourselves as system and system transformation. Business alone cannot transform systems. We understand that. There's policies in place, there's financial players in place, there's technology that we need to develop. So business needs to collaborate. It needs to collaborate with each other. It needs to collaborate with policymakers. It needs to collaborate with innovators, startups, and scientists to find better ways forward. Capitalism will change in the following ways, and this is not just a story from Vision 2050. This is actually happening today. So TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, is likely to become a mandatory governance framework after COP26. So the fact that boards should include climate risks in their risk assessment, should include clear disclosures on climate impacts in their disclosures to capital markets, and should build scenarios around that is now there. Capital markets are beginning to ask very tough questions about the climate impacts of your business. Larry Fink from BlackRock is always the face of that conversation. The Climate Action 100 and roadshows that you'll be doing in North America and Europe will all be asking these questions. ESG, the disclosure of your sustainability performance, will be standardized by the IFRS at the end of this year. Accounting rules will be formed in the coming 2 years that will force every company to disclose its ESG performance in a standardized way. And this all will make sure that capital markets get a much better understanding of the sustainability performance of any company in the world, and as such, will be able to differentiate the cost of capital for companies depending on their sustainability performance. So the future is, from that point of view, very clear. More sustainable businesses will be better able to manage their environmental or social risks, and as such, will attract a lower cost of capital, i.e., will be able to lend money at lower interest rates or attract a higher PE ratio in equity markets. So that's the fundamental change that sustainability and business is now going through. It used to be something good to society. It is now directly going to impact the financial rewards that a business can attract in capital markets or in lending situations. So what can you do in Peru will be your question now. Well, first and foremost, let me congratulate you on the launch of Peru Sustainable. I think Peru 2021 was set up 27 years ago. So being with you in 2021 is in itself formidable. And congratulations on setting up the new initiative. I know the country is going through its own set of challenges, political, economic, the pandemic, but business leaders must keep their eye on the horizon, must now really look at the 3 global challenges that I described. What every business leader in Peru can do is the following. Look at what is my business exposure to the 3 global challenges described: climate emergency, loss of nature, mounting inequality. What is my risk exposure? But equally important, what are my opportunities to innovate, to bring solutions to the Peruvians in these times? The second set is you must set really clear targets, beginning with climate targets. In our assessment, any business that has not yet set a net zero target for climate impacts is no longer a serious business. The same will happen with nature or biodiversity targets, and soon the same questions will be asked on inequality. I do not think about sustainability as a doom and gloom agenda. I think this is the biggest innovation opportunity for business that we've ever had in our lifetimes. We need completely new ways to transport ourselves, new ways to feed the population, new ways to provide energies to markets, new thinking in the buildings we use, and business is the innovation center for all those changes. And last, and directly linked to the change in capitalism, we need to adapt the governance models, get ready to integrate ESG into our own decision-making, performance management, and then into the disclosure to external stakeholders. There's lots of international movements this year. It's, I think, 2 weeks from now, next week even, the IUCN will meet in Marseille in France on the World Conservation Congress. The Food System Summit will be held virtually in New York at the end of September. And of course, the big event this year will be COP26 in early November in Glasgow in the United Kingdom. So this is time to transform. This is the time for innovation. I truly hope Peru and Peru Sustainable will be able to take the lead in that. And I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And congratulations for having developed the Vision 2020. It's a very clear framework to jumpstart organizations into actions. I think that if I had to summarize your presentation with one special phrase that you mentioned, especially designed for CEOs and business leaders, is the following: shareholders are not the only stakeholders. I think that phrase summarizes how much we have to redesign capitalism to make sure that we turn our organizations and our countries into sustainable models. So we have and I would like to add also that your Vision 2050 framework should be included in every organization's strategic plan. I think it has to be discussed. The framework that you've laid out for everyone has to be put in front of the CEOs and all management committees to make sure that they discuss and they address every single aspect of it and include it in their medium and long-term vision. So congratulations for that, and thank you for sharing the time with us. We have a few questions, if time permits, that we'd like to ask you, and hopefully we can address all of them. The first one would be, you've mentioned that Peru and our developing countries have unique challenges that are often different from those in developed countries such as Europe, Asia, and North America. How would you recommend, and you've mentioned some of these, but maybe we can double click on it. How would you recommend that we connect and act upon Vision 2050?
I think you're absolutely right that different parts of the world, different countries will deal with different challenges, and therefore the priorities and the actions that you will put forward need to reflect that. I think if we take mounting inequality, is probably a topic that we really need to address in the developing world at first, and therefore we need to come up with solutions. What I see now, for instance, and I mentioned earlier, the Food System Summit is happening end of September. We all know that supply chains, no matter where people are, of where food is produced, often runs into countries like Peru in other parts of the world. And we need to not just think about where the food is consumed, we need to think about solutions across the whole supply chain. And that is something that I would suggest companies inside Peru should really tap into. There's now a global movement to change supply chains. That's where you can participate. When it comes to solutions and innovations for climate or for biodiversity loss, developing countries may actually be in a beneficial position in the sense that a lot of the infrastructure that the Western world has built may not be in place in the same way as it is in the Western world. Therefore, the whole issue of stranded assets, of assets that you can no longer use, are not a problem in your countries. And it's a real opportunity to jump to new innovations straight ahead. But I agree with you, we need to tailor the solutions to the needs of the people in Peru.
Thank you for that, Peter. A second question that we have from our panel here is the inequality embedded in the current form of capitalism is generating, as you mentioned, discontent around the world. We're seeing an increased number of social protests and multiple movements that advocate for a new social pact. What changes does the private sector need to make in order to transition towards a more inclusive capitalism?
Yeah, so two answers on that one. Of the three sustainability challenges that I mentioned, climate, nature, inequality, we have to be honest as business leaders that we have not made enough progress of all three in inequality. We have often thought that's an issue for the government, for tax regimes, whatever it may be. We believe that's no longer sufficient. We actually believe that if inequality is not addressed by business, business will lose its license to operate, and society will not be able to deal with climate and biodiversity loss in the same powerful way as when we do. So we will be launching the Business Commission to tackle inequality in September of this year, to really bring businesses from around the world together. And if there's any Peruvian leader who would like to join that effort, please let me know and reach out, because we'd love to have a Peruvian voice in that conversation to say, what is it that business can do? Let me give you a short menu of things that anyone can already now begin to think about. The first one is, of course, respect human rights across all of the supply chains. So whatever supply chain the business you're involved in is working on, make sure human rights are respected. The second question is, do we pay people a living wage, a decent income for the work they do, no matter where they are in the supply chain? So again, in the Food System Summit that will happen next month in New York, there is a coalition for living wage that is going to be launched globally to ensure that decent income will be paid. Then possibly slightly more controversial elements of inequality is, are businesses paying their fair share of taxes? And that's a topic that will also have to be addressed, because we cannot expect to be seen to be part of the solution in inequality and not pay our fair share of the public costs that we are all part of. So I think those are some of the topics that the Business Commission will put on its agenda. We'll see what solutions business can actually provide into this, and that really should become a new sustainability agenda for the next 5 years.
Thank you, Peter, again for that open invitation for any Peruvian to join in that forum to keep learning about the latest trends, especially in inequality. If I had to summarize, three things that you mentioned is for all business leaders to respect human rights, to ask our questions, do we pay a decent income? And that is a question regardless of which country do you operate. And if you operate in more than one country, then the question has to be asked for each and every country and each and every position that you hold in your organization. And the third one is, our business paying a fair share of taxes, which you mentioned that it's a controversial one, but it shouldn't really be a controversial one. Moving into another question, Peter, is it possible to impact and work with a supply chain that is recovering from the economic recession and struggling to survive? I guess the question here is, given the nature of the crisis, regardless of which country you are, and Peru has been hit the hardest, as you know, but given the nature of the crisis, economic, health crisis, in our case, political, but is it possible to really impact and to change structurally supply chain and recover from recession and look into sustainability at the same time?
Yeah, I think the other way to ask that same question is it possible to be successful in a supply chain or in a business without addressing climate change, without addressing inequality? Because as we just said, social unrest is on the rise. If we do not make sure that we contribute to the resolution for inequality, people will no longer want to work in that particular supply chain or particular business. We now see everywhere in the world, and I hope the damage in Peru is not as bad as it is in some other parts, but everywhere in the world we see forest fires, we see droughts, we see storms of unprecedented, we see rainfall that is completely off. The risks of not acting in climate change will be so disruptive, not only to the people of the world, but also to supply chains of the world, that we have no opportunity not to address these issues. So yes, we understand in some supply chains there will be economic pressures as a result of COVID. And obviously we have to be realistic and address those. But we must not think that it means we can go back to our old models and continue as if the other challenges do not exist. The question really is, we cannot run business as usual the way we did. We need to move to a system that addresses these major challenges.
We have, thank you for that answer, Peter. We have we have time for one final question, which is very important for us because it's the basis and the genesis of Perú Sostenible here, which is alliances. So the question for you, for WBCSD, how relevant is it to generate alliances between businesses, network, civil organizations, governments, and academia? How do these alliances impact the social, economic, and environmental challenges that we currently have?
Yeah, I'm very, very clear about that. You know, Vision 2050, as I said, the center of the thinking is we need to transform systems. It is a system transformation. That means it is not just about your business transforming or the product transforming. It is really talking to consumers about what is a more sustainable consumption pattern. What are more sustainable products to use or to consume? It is talking to all suppliers on how do we make sure that if we want to build a zero-emission car, we get zero-emission steel, zero-emission plastics. So the whole supply chain needs to be on board of the collaboration, and that can only be done through alliances. We need to build new connections to governments because we need regulation that supports system transformation rather than inhibits it, like is the case in many situations today. We need to collaborate with science, with startups, with entrepreneurs who have the new ideas to change models and really help them scale up. So collaboration is the cornerstone of changing system transformation. And alliances are often the best way to shape those collaborations. So Miguel, from my point of view, if in Peru Sustainable, you have put alliances at the center, you've done exactly the right thing.
Thank you for that, Peter. As you mentioned, collaboration is a core to develop a better society and a more sustainable society. We fully agree with you. We strongly believe that even one company is an ecosystem, including their customers, their suppliers, their shareholders, regulators, and that company cannot operate alone. It operates with other companies, with regulators, and it encompasses an even larger ecosystem. And only through alliances, as you mentioned, is that we can take the whole society to the next level. So our time is up, Peter, and we want you to thank you. I want you to thank you on behalf of Perú Sostenible and on behalf of all our audience today for sharing your time and for sharing your valuable insights and for helping us design a better future for our country. With that, please share with us your final words and thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you, everybody online. It's fantastic that despite the challenges that Peru as a country faces, that Perú Sostenible is on the rise. Count on us to provide any support, whether it's Vision 2050 or otherwise. Please join the global efforts, whether it's the Business Commission to tackle inequality, the food system transformation, we'll be very happy to be supportive, and good luck with your meeting today. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Peter. Switch to Spanish. Invitamos a todos, espero hayan disfrutado de esta extraordinaria charla de Peter. Invitamos a todos a que nos sigan acompañando en el siguiente bloque, donde hablaremos de transformación de la mano de Carmen Yulín y Francisco de la Rosa, Pancho de la Rosa, presentado por Supermercados Peruanos.